A young man named Paul lived in a small village called Green Valley. He was only 21 years old, but he had a big responsibility. When Paul was just a little boy, 5 years old, his parents passed away. Since then, Paul has had to take care of his elder sister, who was ready to get married, and his younger brother, who went to school daily. Paul woke up very early in the morning, even before the sun came up. He would go to the vegetable market to buy fresh vegetables. Paul knew that people in the village liked to eat fresh and healthy food, so he always made sure to get the best vegetables. Paul sold these vegetables in 2 ways. In the daytime, from 9 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, he would walk around the village streets. He carried his vegetables in a handcart and shouted, "Buy vegetables! Fresh green vegetables for sale!" Everyone knew Paul's voice and trusted his vegetables because they were so fresh. In the evening from 7 to 11 at night, Paul set up a little cart in a small market near his house. There, people would come to buy vegetables after a long day's work. They liked buying from Paul because he was friendly, and his vegetables were the best in the village. Despite having 2 other vegetable sellers in the same area, everyone preferred to buy from Paul. His vegetables were a little more expensive, but people didn't mind because they knew they were getting the freshest vegetables available. Paul worked hard every day to make sure his family had enough to eat and that his sister could get married happily. He knew his parents would be proud of how he took care of everyone, just like they taught him when they were still alive. Paul's success as a vegetable seller did not go unnoticed by everyone in the village. 2 other vegetable sellers, who also set up their stalls nearby, started to feel jealous of Paul. Their names were Mr. Smith and Mrs. Brown. Mr. Smith and Mrs. Brown were upset because even though they sold their vegetables at lower prices, people still preferred to buy from Paul. They would mutter to each other whenever Paul walked by with his handcart of fresh greens. "How does he do it?" Mr. Smith would grumble. "His vegetables are too expensive, and yet everyone buys from him." Mrs. Brown would nod in agreement. "It's not fair. We work just as hard, but no one notices us." One day, as Paul was walking through the village, Mr. Smith and Mrs. Brown decided to try and find out Paul's secret. They followed him discreetly, watching where he went and how he sold his vegetables. They saw Paul greeting each customer with a smile and offering them the best vegetables from his handcart. People would stop and chat with Paul, asking about his day and his family. Paul always took the time to listen and make sure everyone got what they needed. Mr. Smith and Mrs. Brown tried to copy Paul's friendly manner and shout louder about their vegetables, but it didn't work. People still walked past their stalls and came to Paul instead. Frustrated and angry, Mr. Smith and Mrs. Brown started to plot against Paul. They whispered to each other about ways to make him look bad or scare him away from the village. They wanted everyone to buy from them instead of Paul. Little did they know that their jealousy would soon lead to a dangerous plan that would change everything for Paul and the village. Every day, as Paul walked through the village selling his vegetables, he noticed an old woman who would stop and ask about the prices, but never buy anything. She lived in a small cottage by herself, and Paul often wondered about her. One evening, as Paul was packing up his cart after a long day at the market, he saw the old woman passing by again. This time, he decided to stop and talk to her. "Ma'am," Paul said kindly, "I see you every day asking about the vegetables, but never buying any. Is there a reason why?" The old woman looked at Paul with sad eyes. "Oh, young man," she sighed. "Your vegetables are the best in the village, but I am alone and have no family to help me. I survive by begging and can't afford to buy vegetables." Paul felt a pang of sympathy for the old woman. "Ma'am, from now on, come to the market every night before I close. I'll give you whatever vegetables are left for free. It's the least I can do." The old woman hesitated. She was not used to receiving charity. "Oh no, dear boy, I can't take them for free. I have a little money saved up from my begging." "You can take whatever I have." Paul shook his head firmly. "No, ma'am. Please take the vegetables. I have to sell fresh ones every day, and it would help me." Reluctantly, the old woman agreed, touched by Paul's kindness. From then on, she would come to Paul's cart every evening, and he would give her a bag of fresh vegetables with a warm smile. Meanwhile, Mr. Smith and Mrs. Brown, the jealous vegetable sellers, watched this exchange with narrowed eyes. They were not happy that Paul was helping the old woman. They knew they had to come up with a plan to stop him once and for all. Mr. Smith and Mrs. Brown couldn't stand seeing Paul's kindness towards the old woman. They felt more jealous and angry than ever before. They wanted to teach Paul a lesson and make sure he wouldn't be the best vegetable seller in the village anymore. One gloomy evening, as Paul was packing up his cart after another successful day at the market, Mr. Smith and Mrs. Brown secretly followed him. They waited for the perfect moment when Paul was alone on a deserted road. Suddenly, they jumped out of their hiding place and confronted Paul. "So, Paul," Mr. Smith sneered, "you think you're better than us, huh? Selling your expensive vegetables and giving them away for free to beggars?" Mrs. Brown chimed in. "You've gotten too big for your boots, Paul. It's time we teach you a lesson." Paul was startled and scared. He had heard rumors about Mr. Smith and Mrs. Brown not liking him, but he never thought they would go this far. "What do you want from me?" Paul asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "We want you to leave the village," Mr. Smith said with a menacing glare. "We don't want competition like you around here." Paul looked around, hoping someone would come to help him, but the road was empty and it was getting darker by the minute. Just when things seemed hopeless, the old woman happened to pass by. She saw Mr. Smith and Mrs. Brown shouting at Paul and immediately understood that he was in trouble. "Help! Somebody help!" the old woman screamed at the top of her lungs. "Save him! Someone!" Startled by the old woman's cries, Mr. Smith and Mrs. Brown realized they had been seen. They exchanged frightened glances, and then, without another word, turned and ran away into the night. Paul stood there, shaking with fear and relief. The old woman rushed to his side, her eyes full of concern. "Are you all right, my dear boy?" she asked, touching his arm gently. Paul nodded, still trying to catch his breath. Thank you so much, ma'am. You saved my life." The old woman smiled warmly. "I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. You've been so kind to me, Paul. How could I not help?" Paul hugged the old woman gratefully. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to," the old woman said softly. "You've already done enough for me." As they walked back to Paul's house together, Paul made a decision. He couldn't let the old woman go back to her lonely cottage. She had become like family to him, and he wanted her to stay with him and his siblings. Paul and the old woman walked back to his house, their steps lighter now that the danger had passed. Paul couldn't stop thinking about how the old woman had saved him from Mr. Smith and Mrs. Brown. "Ma'am," Paul said as they reached his doorstep, "I can't thank you enough for what you did back there. You saved my life." The old woman smiled kindly at him. "It was the least I could do, Paul. You've been so generous to me with your vegetables. I couldn't just stand by and watch." Paul nodded gratefully. "You've become like family to me, ma'am. I don't have a mother anymore, and my sister and brother could use someone wise like you around." The old woman's eyes twinkled with surprise and happiness. "Oh, Paul, that's very kind of you, but I don't want to be a burden." Paul shook his head firmly. "You're not a burden, ma'am. Please come and live with us. We have plenty of space, and it would mean so much to us." The old woman hesitated for a moment, touched by Paul's offer. She had lived alone for so long, and the idea of being part of a family again warmed her heart. "Well," she finally said with a smile, "if you're sure it's all right." Paul nodded eagerly. "Absolutely, ma'am. You'll have your room, and we'll take care of you, just like family." With that, the old woman agreed to move in with Paul and his siblings. As they entered the house, Paul introduced her to his elder sister, who was busy preparing dinner, and his younger brother, who was finishing his homework at the kitchen table. "This is Mrs. Johnson," Paul said proudly. "She's going to live with us now." Mrs. Johnson smiled warmly at Paul's siblings. "Hello, dears. It's lovely to meet you." Paul's sister and brother greeted Mrs. Johnson shyly, but with curiosity. They could tell she was kind and gentle, just like Paul had described. That night, as they all sat down for dinner together, Paul couldn't help but feel grateful. Despite the scare with Mr. Smith and Mrs. Brown, something good had come out of it. Mrs. Johnson had brought a new sense of warmth and companionship to their home, and Paul knew they were all better off with her there. In the days that followed, Mrs. Johnson settled into life with Paul and his siblings. She quickly became a beloved member of their household, bringing a sense of calm and wisdom that they all cherished. Paul's elder sister, Mary, found comfort in having another woman around the house. She appreciated Mrs. Johnson's advice on cooking and homemaking, and they often spent afternoons together discussing wedding plans. Mary was relieved to have someone to confide in about her hopes and worries. Paul's younger brother, Michael, looked up to Mrs. Johnson like a grandmother. He enjoyed listening to her stories about the village when she was younger and eagerly absorbed the lessons she shared about life and kindness. As for Paul, having Mrs. Johnson around eased some of the burdens he had carried alone for so long. He no longer felt overwhelmed by the responsibilities of providing for his family. With Mrs. Johnson's help, he could manage the household more effectively, ensuring everyone was cared for and looked after. The evenings became a time for the family to bond even more deeply. They would gather around the dinner table, sharing stories and laughter. Mrs. Johnson's presence brought a sense of unity and happiness that Paul had missed since his parents passed away. One day, as they sat in the garden enjoying the afternoon sun, Paul expressed his gratitude to Mrs. Johnson once again. "I can't thank you enough for coming into our lives, Mrs. Johnson," he said sincerely. "You've brought so much joy and peace to our home." Mrs. Johnson smiled warmly. "Oh, Paul, you and your siblings have been a blessing to me as well. I never expected to find such a loving family to belong to." Paul's heart swelled with happiness. He knew that having Mrs. Johnson with them was not just about having another person in the house. It was about having someone who cared deeply for them. Someone who understood the hardships they had faced and was willing to share in their joys and sorrows. As they sat together that evening, Paul silently vowed to always cherish and protect the newfound happiness they had found as a family.